Hi, I'm Professor Dick Siepmann of Osnabrück University. Today I want to talk you through some of the ways in which you can use the Sketchengine to do research, and more specifically vocabulary research. The Sketchengine is a corpus query tool, so that's a tool that allows you to ask and answer questions about the way words behave in a particular environment. That environment is the corpus, a collection of texts of either general or more specialized nature. So the Sketchengine is just that, a useful tool. It's not going to be helpful if you don't have any questions, and if you have a research question, it's not going to answer it automatically. The questions need to come first in any research. The best questions are ones that identify a research gap, something that's never been explored before or that hasn't received much attention yet. You can come up with good research questions by reading the existing literature on a particular topic, but sometimes I also recommend just exploring your linguistic intuitions about a particular corpus environment. Occasionally also, and this has been the case with much early corpus research, new tools or methods like the Sketchengine will allow you to make unprecedented discoveries. We could draw an analogy here between the tools and methods used in corpus linguistics and the huge radio telescopes used in astronomy. Both allow us to see things that are normally invisible to the naked eye. With a normal telescope, you can't reach much further than our solar system, but radio telescopes reach far beyond that. So just as the radio telescope makes it possible to discover and explore trillions of stars and planets, so tools like the Sketchengine allow us to look at vast amounts of language at the same time. Sometimes, of course, such masses of data may also be a bit overwhelming or confusing, and this is where the researcher comes in again. The researcher needs to carefully observe the data, classify them, and so on. But as we've been saying, first he or she needs a research question. One of the things that astronomers wanted to find out about, for example, is if there's life on other planets. To answer that question, apart from the radio telescope, they needed specific methods. And using those methods, they did indeed find evidence of what we now call exoplanets, planets that are similar in composition and location to our Earth. Now, one linguistic galaxy that we might point our telescope at is, of course, academic English. Millions of researchers and students worldwide have to master this variety of English. Academic English is not a mere lingua franca we can get by with small basic vocabulary. That's something we need to realize. Developing a confident command of this variety is no mean feat at all. And it would be helpful for the academic community to have a clear description of the vocabulary learning task that's involved. An important part of that learning task is learning the typical rhetorical moves that academic speakers and academic writers use to make their texts or talks flow smoothly. So, for example, a speaker might use a phrase like to come back to return to a previous point. Or here's a quote from to introduce a quotation, where a writer might prefer something more formal. And this brings us to our research question. How do these phrases vary between speech and writing? Which phrases can be used in both speech and writing, and which should be confined to one variety? What materials do we need to answer this research question? Well, to begin with, of course, we need two large corpora, one containing academic writing, the other academic speech. I've compiled two such corpora and they're available to you in the Sketchengine. The spoken corpus is based on YouTube videos about academic events, lectures, discussions, teaching, and so on. Why do we need large corpora? After all, there's been some previous research on words and phrases in academic speech, and in academic writing for that matter. Michael McCarthy and Ronald Carter found, for example, that in terms of is considerably more frequent in academic language than it is in, say, everyday conversation. And it's a useful phrase that many students might not know, in terms of. However, the my case corpus of spoken academic interaction they used only comprises 1.8 million words, and it's a well-known fact that we can only detect recurrent phrases from a corpus size of 30 million words upwards. So I decided to make my corpus large enough to be able to find phrases and regularities and variation in phrases. The spoken corpus comprises 80 million words and the written corpus around 400 million. So now I'm going to take you through some of the functions for investigating research questions that the Sketchengine suite of tools offers. After a quick look at the word list and anagram functions, we're going to focus on just two keywords, and how their use inside phrases differs between speech and writing, academic speech and writing, that is. These words are the noun mention and the verb pause. Now, it's pretty clear from the general meaning that the phrases they occur in will be about adding information in the case of mention and about interrupting the flow of the argument in the case of pause. What we're particularly interested in here is the large amount of variation in the way a phrase can be made up. The actual words are not always fixed, and some don't always need to be present. The word order can also vary, and some words may vary in their inflections, while others appear only in one form of the phrase. So on the surface of the language, we tend to see a lot of variation, and the regularities of phrases are often not obvious, because it's not often that exactly the same sequence of words recurs. We're aware of some repetition, but when we look carefully, there always seems to be a lot of variation. What the computer does is allow us to gather together a lot of instances, and it makes them easy to compare and see just what repetition and regularity there is. To get a close-up look at how these words function in these different environments, we'll be using the word sketch and concordancing functions. And oddly enough, we're also going to rely on our good old close reading skills to find out more. If you're a student in Germany, your first port of call to access the Sketchengine would be what's called the Datenbank Infosystem, which is available from your local university library, but also accessible via the internet, of course. Excuse me. So you'd type Sketchengine into the search box, and this should take you to the page from which you can access the Sketchengine. You would have to click here. I need to access the Sketchengine via its homepage, which is www.sketchengine.eu. And this should take us to the dashboard page, which gives us an overview of the various functions that Sketchengine offers for investigating language. As I said earlier, we're going to focus today on the word list function, the concordance function, and the word sketch function, and anagrams, and perhaps even keywords. We might take a brief look at keywords now. Okay, so let's start with the word list. Of course, you'd have to enter the corpus we're looking for. We're going to use IT EduScience corpus and the Geography corpus today. So IT EduScience, that's the YouTube corpus of spoken academic English I've compiled. And we're already there, so let's explore this corpus a little bit by looking at the most frequent words that occur in this corpus, and this is what word list is all about, creating a list of the most frequent words in a corpus. And here we'll just use words rather than lemmas. As you can see, you've got several choices here, but we'll use all the words rather than all the lemmas or all the nouns. And I'll just click on go here. Off we go. And we can see which words are the most frequent ones in our IT EduScience corpus. This is not terribly surprising. The is usually the most frequent word. A comma apparently is also counted here, which is even more frequent, and the full stop is also included in this count. And yes, we can see this is typical of a spoken corpus. Word forms like going, which occur, for instance, in the verb form I'm going to, and so on. So this is a typical word list. What might be more interesting is the keywords list. So let's compile a keyword list. And this will also compile multi-word terms, in this case basically multi-word collocations. This is going to take some time, although I did the calculation earlier, so it shouldn't take that long. Yes, now keywords are words that occur more frequently than would be expected by random chance or random probability. So words that occur disproportionately in a particular corpus compared to another corpus. And we can see that the reference corpus that Sketchengine has been comparing this to is the English Web, which is a general internet corpus. So words that are disproportionately frequent in this corpus of subtitles, as for instance inaudible, applause, students, looking, yeah, which is clearly a response token in spoken language. So you'd expect to find it in this kind of corpus. Going, cheering, and so wanna. So lots of colloquial elements, which we would also find probably in a conversational corpus, a corpus of English conversation. Let's have a look at the multi-word terms. And next slide, for instance, is very common. That's something, of course, we wouldn't find in a corpus of conversation. So there's a clear difference here already with a corpus of everyday conversation. But a little bit is clearly something we'd also expect there. So apparently, spoken academic English shares a lot of its common phrases with everyday conversation. So if you've mastered everyday conversation, you've already progressed quite a bit towards being able to speak in academic language. Okay, so that's the multi-word term function, and finally we're going to take a look at the engrams function. Now engrams are actually something quite simple. These are words that occur one after another in the corpus, words that occur in succession with a particular frequency again. And again, it might be particularly interesting to look at key engrams. Again, these are the ones that occur more frequently than will be predicted by random chance. Again, we're using the English Web Corpus as a reference corpus. So let's have a look at what this will give us. Again, basically it just needs to retrieve this from memory because I already did the calculation a few days ago. Again, we see the similarity with everyday conversation. You know, being a discourse marker response token, again, which is very frequent in conversation. We're going to, which is perhaps more frequent in the academic corpus because it's used at the outset of a talk, for instance, to describe what the speaker is going to do, a little bit and so on. So many of these engrams would also be found in everyday conversation. But if we go down the list a bit, we will also find things that are probably quite specific, quite unique to academic English. Let's have a look. We need to go quite far down. Make sure that perhaps is, we just had that somewhere, make sure that may be a little specific to spoken academic English. Excuse me. Let's go to the next page. This is going to take a few seconds. Taking longer than expected. Okay. Have to understand, for instance, that's here is clearly a phrase that is probably, if not unique, of course, but fairly specific to academic English. Let's see if we can find more, but most of this looks to me as if it might also occur in everyday conversation. So you can see at the highest frequency levels, a lot of material in this corpus is shared with everyday conversation, and spoken academic English is very much like everyday conversation. So we're now going to start our little investigation into the noun mention and later the verb pause. Now what we want to find out is how mention, the noun, is used in phrases that indicate addition, adding something to the current discourse, if you like. And for that purpose we're going to use the word sketch function first of all to investigate what sort of environment the noun mention usually occurs in. Now we could do a basic search, of course, but that would probably give us the verb mention, and we're interested in the noun mention, so we can tag this here. We enter mention and we click on noun down here in the part of speech box. We don't want to investigate the whole corpus in geography because this would include the spoken corpus. The YT EduScience corpus is also included in geography. So we just want the written corpus, which can be selected via a subcorpus. So here we go. And as you can see, word sketch gives us a very clear overview of the collocational environment of mention. Here we have typical pre-modifiers of the noun mention in academic writing, and these are typical verbs that are used with mention. Let's see if we can find more evidence of the kinds of phrases we're looking for, phrases that are used to add something, that serve the function of adding something to the current discourse. Let's just explore a bit. So here we have all the adjectives that seem to be used with mention: a brief mention, scant mention. Warrant, of course, is a verb. That's the kind of thing that sometimes happens. This has been wrongly placed here. Casual mention, occasional mention. Not all of these may be relevant to the routine formula we're looking at. Okay, so if we want to find out more about how brief is used in front of mention, we can click on these three dots here, and this should take us through to the concordance of mention and brief, and we can already see that the second sentence is exactly what we're looking for. 2 points warrant brief mention. This is something that the speaker wants to introduce into his text at this particular point, adding something to the existing discourse, and that's the kind of phrase we would want to remember. Sorry about that. If you want to save, copy this line to the clipboard and paste it into a Word file, for instance, then you can click on this symbol here at the end of the concordance line. Now the other uses of mention or brief mention, in the first sentence here, for instance, describe what others have done. So this is not a rhetorical move that the writers of the article themselves make, but rather a description of what others have done. A brief mention by King and Willer, a discussion by Burke, and so on. So this doesn't count as the kind of routine formula use that we're looking for. This is the same thing. It omits all but the briefest mention, commenting on a book. But again, down here we have several other findings from Model 3 deserve brief mention. That's again the use we're looking for. Something deserves brief mention, so we'd copy that to the clipboard, and so on. We will now go through the rest of the concordance and look for similar examples. It deserves a brief mention here. That would be another one. And so on. Now we need to go back. We could do the same thing with scanned. But this is again only about the research that other people have carried out. Scanned mention was made of. That's a comment on someone else's work. Something received scanned mentioned, and so on. So this is not relevant to our investigation, because we're looking for uses of mention as a discourse marker that serves the function of adding something to the current discourse. Okay, back to the word sketch, and now we would go through the rest of the list. We could also look, of course, at mention plus verb. We might be a little more successful. Yes, so here we can say this is the kind of use we're looking for. A few deserve specific mention. 3 of the immigrants from the archipelago deserve special mention. Many individuals deserve special mention. So these are examples we might want to save. Merit is a synonym, of course, of deserve, and we can already see that there's a lot of varieties, something I've said before, at the textual surface, but the underlying meaning is always the same. So, 3 popular books on the subject of networks merit a mention. Here we have mention used with a definite article. There's a lot of variation here as well. We get both, for instance, merit a brief mention, or merit brief mention, or merit some mention. All of that needs to be noted, and we can save the sentences, the concordance lines, as evidence of these uses, so that we at the end of the day we can give a full description of the variation found with this particular discourse marker. Warrant, again similar to merit, also means justify. 2 points, warrant brief mention, warrant a brief mention. Again, there's variation in article use here. Also warrant a brief mention. Again, these are useful variations. Now we need to go back. Mention, noun, and we're using the written corpus. So we've already seen quite a bit of variation here. One other verb that might be interesting is make. How is make used with mention? Of course, they made no mention of something, but again, that's describing what other people have done. But we can already see the passive structure is can mention was made of, and this also occurs as a discourse marker. Let's see if we can find any examples. All of the examples we've looked at so far are about other authors making no mention, or as the case may be, making mention of something. So here we have an example where an author uses make brief mention. I would like to make brief mention of Beckett's affinity in an active structure. I think we may have done something wrong here. Let's go back. I think I may have forgotten to use the correct subcorpus. No, apparently not. So let's go back to the mention concordance. I'm a bit surprised actually that we haven't found any evidence of discourse markers here. Typically, the discourse marker is takes the following form: special mention must be made of, or something like that, or only the briefest mention can be made of. But evidence of this is hard to come by, apparently. This is rather surprising. Now we've gone through the entire list and we haven't found a single example, which is odd. Let's take a look at special. And yes, here we do find some examples. Special mention should be made of Marie-Madeleine Gauthier. Special mention must be made of. So this is a use where mention is usually combined with a modal verb expressing a necessity and the passive form of make. Okay, as you can see, we can collect a lot of useful material by starting with an investigation via the word sketch function and then looking at the specific concordances. We now collect all of these and collect them in a Word file, for instance, and try to find out how much variation there is on the surface. But of course, as I've said before, the underlying meaning of this particular discourse marker is always identical. Now, intuition might tell us that things might be entirely different in the spoken corpus, spoken academic corpus. Of course, we can search, we can do the same sort of search here. Mention as a noun, or corpus in this case. But we would only find, well, apparently we do find some examples of deserve mention, because sometimes people adopt rather formal ways of putting things from written academic English. So this is fairly formal. Now, some common oxymorons that definitely deserve a mention. Certainly, you're right, they deserve a mention or two. I think deserves a real mention. So this is rather formal, but it does also occur in speech, apparently. That's interesting. So we get a little bit of overlap here between speech and writing, which we would need to investigate further. But we can already see this has been wrongly tagged. Here we have the verb mention, and what people normally say in conversation, also in academic talks, is the thing I want to mention is, or I'm just going to mention, but this is the verb. So actually this is wrongly tagged and shouldn't appear here, but these things happen. Okay, so we do have a few uses of mention as a noun with deserve, even in spoken academic English. Of course, these uses have sort of been appropriated, as I was saying, from written academic English, and that's quite normal. If you write a lot in academic English, you will adopt some of those phrases that you use in your own writing into your speech. But let's look at the verb, which is far more frequent, of course. As you can see here, 22,000 occurrences, and of course the verb would be used for the same functions, and as we can see here, the verb usually combines with an adverb. So rather than a noun plus adjective combination, something warrants a brief mention, what we get here is mention plus briefly, for instance. These are really great resources, but I can mention briefly in a presentation. I mentioned briefly blah blah blah, so I'll briefly mention that. I'll mention briefly how that's going to unfold nationally. All of these are typical examples of, well, almost everyday uses of mention, but of course these are particularly frequent in spoken academic English because this sort of discourse marker is required to fulfill a particular function, namely, as we've said it several points already, that of adding information. Now there are two questions we haven't really given fully satisfactory answers to. The first of these is, can we find exact correspondences between writing and speech in this area? So does a phrase like this deserves a brief mention have an exact equivalent in speech? So that's something we might look at. And the other question is there more variation in the noun phrase in the nominal expression that features mention? So the question would be, are there other nouns that can fulfill the same purpose as mention, so that we get a variation on the textual surface but the same underlying meaning using another noun? And that's what we're going to explore first now. How do we go about this? This requires a little thought. What we might do, for instance, is use the verb deserve, which often occurs in the phrase we've been looking at, and search for other nominal objects that occur with deserve. So we're in geography, we're using the written corpus again, and we are searching for we're doing a word sketch basically on deserve. So what are the objects of deserve that might count as candidates for our phrase? Let's have a look. Scrutiny sounds interesting, and that's the top colloquy here. So let's have a look at the concordance. Such topics deserve scrutiny. Impressive discursive shift, and one that deserves close scrutiny. But this is not the author doing something. This is well, of course the author is saying that something deserves scrutiny. It's not quite the same thing as saying something deserves a brief mention, so it's not not the function of adding something that we're looking at here. Deserves serious scrutiny. Now these phrases might be used, for instance, at the end of an academic article, where writers make recommendations for future research, but they don't perform quite the same function as our mentioned phrase. Deserves greater scrutiny. This is typical. This might be from a conclusion of a research article. The findings from this article suggest that the second assumption deserves greater scrutiny as well. So scrutiny is probably ruled out as a candidate for our phrase. Let's look at certainly not punishment or praise, but consideration. Let's look at that very briefly. This bias deserves consideration. That's very general, and no adjective is used. And if we go down the page, this appears to be similar to the case of scrutiny. These are all phrases that could be used in the conclusion of your article. So that will be another type of phrase. Deserve plus nouns like scrutiny, consideration, exploration, elaboration. All of these phrases could be used in the last section of an article. Now, I could go on and on here, and if I do that, I'll hit on the noun comment right at the end of the list, which you can extend, by the way, by clicking on these arrows. And here I might find something suitable. Deserve some short comment here, for instance. The choice of using fixed effects deserves some comment. Now that is very similar to mention, and so we've found another noun that can be used in a phrase, in a phraseological expression that has the same function as our mention phrase. So we've solved that problem. Now for a second question, we need to go back to the Euclid corpus. I've already opened this here, and we need to do a CQL search, a search using regular expression in the concordance window. Basically, what this says is, does the word mention meet with the words brief or briefly within a space of 4 words to the left or 4 words to the right? So we need to cast our net widely, because we want both the noun and the verb mention, but we don't need forms like mentions, because that will be a third person use, and we're only interested in what the author or speaker is doing, so mention is probably sufficient. So this is a rather complex CQL query that you don't need to worry about at this stage, but I'll just click on go. Something went
wrong. Always better to copy what you've already typed in here. I'll go back to the dashboard, start concordance again, CQL, paste in my query, and click on go. Something went wrong. These things happen, as with any computer software. Let's see what happens if we use the other window. OIT, add your science. Let's paste this in again. Query itself seems to be okay. Let me just check. Okay. You can see how sensitive these queries are. We need to use inverted commas here. So now this should work. And remember, we're looking for precise correspondences between writing and speech here. So remember, what does the nominal expression featuring mention do? It serves the basic function of adding something, we said, and it very often contains necessity, a modal necessity. So something like special mention must be made of. So let's look at whether we can find something similar here. So just saying I wanted to mention the brief about is not quite the same thing. I briefly want to mention two projects comes closer. I'm going to very briefly mention another competition, also comes close. Let's see if we can find any more precise equivalents. Perhaps something like this that includes the verb want. So we just want to briefly mention the sustainable energy for all initiative, or something like, now let's briefly mention the legal end of things. We could go on, of course. Let's see how many equivalences, or rather how many concordance lines there are. 121. Let's just look at the next page. I just wanted to briefly mention that again, or just to briefly mention, which is a little odd grammatically, but you do find lots of these grammatically perhaps not quite well formed phrases in speech. So I'm just briefly going to mention my personal Mac security website. One other thing I just want to mention, I'm going to mention briefly. So all of these might be useful and fairly precise equivalences to the written form. So we've solved that problem as well. So we're now going to look at pause in both spoken and written academic English, starting with its use in writing. And we're going to use the concordance function for this, and this is perhaps going to be more straightforward than our investigation into the nominal expression that involves mention. So a concordance function, we're going to use the advanced function where pause can be tagged for part of speech. it's a verb, so we need to click on lemma here, verb here, and the lemma we're looking for is pause, and we're using the written subcorpus of geography E. Basically what we need to do is just go through the concordance lines and find examples that illustrate the functional use of pause that we're looking for. This is not going to be easy because there are lots of other uses of pause, and that's why we can't use the word sketch function, for instance, for this purpose, because the other uses would be dominant in that case, and we wouldn't find anything relevant. So let's see. The second line is actually quite interesting. In this paper, we wish to pause for a moment to examine. What we can see here again is sort of a modal verb. We wish to pause for a moment. It's not strictly speaking, it's not classified as a modal verb by linguists, but it does express modality. So we wish to pause for a moment, for a particular time, to do something seems to be a common usage. Okay, so we found one example. We would save this to the clipboard, paste it into a Word file perhaps, for closer examination at a later stage. So let's go down. Can we find anything else? Here I pause a moment to applaud Peter Dickens. Another relevant line. Similar structure, note the infinitive. That's something we can already notice here, because we'll be looking for regularities, of course, within the phrase. So it appears to be followed by an infinitive quite often. Let's go down. One might pause here to consider same structure. Might, modal verb, modifies pause, the deictic element here, and the infinitive. The other uses of pause again describe what other writers have done, so we're not particularly interested in this. It seems excuse me, it seems useful to pause and briefly consider. So here we have a coordinated clause with and. So again we can see there's little variation at the surface, so this definitely needs to go into our selection of phrases. And yeah, well, we could go on, and we'd find more phrases like, I pause here to take stock of these findings. Okay, let's have a look at writing. Oh no, that's speech as well. So let's look at geography. Same type of query. The written version of the corpus. We need the verb again, and we need pause Yes, the second line, for instance, is already relevant for us. Wish to pause for a moment to examine. Here I pause a moment to applaud Peter Dickens's magnificent achievement, and so on. And we'd save all these occurrences, and this will allow us to compare speech and writing.
So before we look at the results, I'm going to take you through the procedure again that we've been following. It consists of 5 to 6 steps. The first step was to use word sketch to discover the typical collocates of mention. So that's mainly a quantitative procedure. It's to do with frequency. Collocates are usually sorted by frequency. The second step took us from word sketch to the concordance lines of particular collocations in the concordance tool, and we gathered together concordance lines of mention that serve the rhetorical functions that we're interested in. The third step involved simply copying and pasting appropriate lines that we found into a Word or Excel file. And I want you to please note that this step will be unnecessary if our aim was to compile a dictionary entry. In that case, we'd look at the entire concordance. Step 4 is a qualitative analysis of concordance lines. So we looked at the left and right context, tried to ferret out patterns and perhaps ontological categories. Step 5, which we'll look at in a second, is the presentation of results in an easily accessible form in a table or in a graph. Now, there might have been an additional step. If we want to look for variation on the textual surface, the procedure would be, and we actually follow that procedure, would be to take a verb, for instance, and look at what other nouns that verb collocates with. And then a second sub-step might be to look at the phrases into which those verb-noun collocations enter into. And then, of course, we need to judge whether the phrases we've found fulfill the same purpose as the expressions involving mention. So these are the results for mention. What we find is that the expression, the phraseological expression we're interested in, comes in 3 forms. The first is a subject noun phrase containing mention or perhaps comment. The verb is a modal expressing necessity, so should, might, or must. The subject, by the way, can be modified, of course, by determiners, or also preceded by the 0 article. Mention must be made of, some mention must be made of, determiner, or adjectives. A brief mention must be made of, special mention must be made of. I left out the examples of objects here. A second structure is perhaps peculiar to comment. Comment is necessary on, or comment is required on. A brief comment is in order on, and so on. And the third structure that we found is a subject NP that combined with a verb like deserve, warrant, call for, or merit, and the same phrases basically that we also have up here. So 2 points warrant brief mention, 2 such conclusions may be worth mention here, or this question requires a final comment. So we've just looked at the written constructions. Let's now turn to the spoken constructions that correspond more or less exactly to the nominal expressions. The function is exactly the same, and what we found are phrases like I want to briefly mention plus nominal phrase, a noun phrase, I will just briefly mention noun phrase, or now let's just briefly mention noun phrase. We also found that the written form is also in evidence. So apparently experienced writers readily slip phrases from their own writing into speech. The other direction is dispreferred, of course, but there are hazy boundaries apparently between academic speech and academic writing as far as the use of phraseological expressions is concerned. Now, the procedure for pause is not at all dissimilar to the one for mention. 4 steps in this case. It's in a way it's a little easier. So again, we collected concordance lines of pause that serve the rhetorical functions that we're interested in. We then copied the lines into a Word or Excel file. Then we did a qualitative analysis of the concordance lines, looked at the context, the patterns, ontological categories, and we'll have a look at the results in the form of a table again, which is an easily accessible form. Now, please note again that we've been analysing specific, somewhat infrequent phrases that can't be detected by means of frequency searches. So that's why we needed to look so closely at all the concordance lines. If we were to compile a dictionary entry on pause, things would be easier because we take the entire concordance or a large random selection into account to produce the dictionary entry. So here we have the written variants of our construction. Construction usually starts off with a phrase containing a first person pronoun, occasionally also the prop word one plus pause. The whole phrase expresses possibility or necessity sometimes. We've got might and must here, for instance, we must pause. One might pause here, or a variant using an it clause is it is worth pausing. This is followed by a time expression or an expression. Usually in the written variants we only get time expressions. Here I pause a moment and then by an infinitive to describe the activity that the author is about to carry out. Here I pause a moment to applaud. One might pause for a moment to consider. We must pause for a moment and ask about. So coordinated clauses, as we've seen, are also possible, either infinitive or coordinated clause. Now, interestingly, as opposed to what we've seen with mention, with pause, it's the spoken variants that seem to be more variable, both in the optional adverb slot, where we have time expressions, but also deictics here and there, and in the clause endings, where apart from the infinitive and the coordinated clause, we've also found before plus the ing or a clause or a prepositional phrase. So I'm going to pause here for something, for a quick polling question. But of course, it's not impossible that we'd also find these clause endings in writing. We just haven't got any evidence in our corpus. And the question that is probably in the minds of some of you is, what is the pedagogic value of all this? Who or what are we doing this for? Well, if you look closely, I think you'll see that one major target audience is people like you. Students have to write and speak in academic English for the first time. You're usually quite fluent in your presentations, but sometimes you use unnatural phrases that don't normally occur in academic speech, and this may be confusing for listeners. I'd consider speech a minor problem though. What's really difficult is the transition from spoken phrases to written phrases, and this is what we've just been working on. So of course, many of you will probably be able to say something like, I want to briefly mention that, but my experience teaches me that you would also use the same phrase in your written work, rather than phrases such as mention should be made of, or X deserves some comment. So this mastery of different styles, especially academic written usage, is of considerable importance in your language learning career, and learning phraseological expressions is a big part of this process. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this audio, and I wish you every success in your own future research and writing endeavours. Thank you for listening.